The doors hadn't fully opened yet, and already Nia felt the air change. She could hear the string quartet through the walls, the low hum of 200 voices dressed in silk and certainty, and somewhere beyond them, David, waiting to marry someone else. Her hand found Kang Min-jae's without thinking. His fingers closed around hers, steady, unbothered, like he'd done this 100 times before, though she knew he hadn't. "Just breathe," he said quietly, not looking at her, watching the doors instead. "I've got you." She wanted to believe it was that simple, that a stranger's calm could hold together a year of pretending she was fine, a year of rebuilding a life 8,000 kilometers from everything she used to know. But her pulse was in her throat, and the doors were already moving, light spilling out from the ballroom like something inevitable. Then she saw him. David turned, mid-laugh, toward the entrance, and the laugh died on his face the moment he saw who was standing beside her. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Not David, not the bride at his side, not the dozens of guests who once knew Nia as the woman David almost married. Min-jae leaned in, his voice barely a breath against her ear. "Smile, he's watching." She smiled, and the room believed every word of the lie that was about to change both their lives. If you're watching this, tell me where in the world you're tuning in from, and subscribe, because tonight, nothing goes the way anyone expects. Nia had spent a year learning how to build a life out of small, deliberate routines. The walk to campus before the streets got busy, the way Mrs. Park always left a plate warming when she came home late. Routines that didn't ask anything of her. Routines that never once mentioned David. The invitation undid all of it in under a minute. It arrived on thick cream paper, gold lettering catching the afternoon light on the kitchen table like it had no idea what it was about to do. David Smith and Han Soo-jin request the honor of your presence. Beneath it, in his own handwriting, a single line. "I hope we can finally find closure." She read it 4 times before she let herself feel anything. 5 years, that's what they'd built before he chose a different future, one shaped by his family's expectations and a career that couldn't wait for her. She hadn't followed him to Seoul. She told herself that constantly, the way you tell yourself something you're still not sure is true. She'd come for the degree, for the version of herself that existed apart from him. That he happened to be here too was supposed to be irrelevant. It had never once felt irrelevant. Now his wedding sat in her hands, and worse than the wedding itself was the guest list she could already picture. People who'd known her as David's Nia. People who would watch her walk in alone and feel sorry for her before she'd said a single word. She couldn't do that. Couldn't give them the satisfaction of watching her prove in real time that she was still alone, still not enough to keep. She thought about not going at all, skipping it, deleting the message, letting David have his closure without her in the room to grant it. But some stubborn, wounded part of her wanted him to see her, not broken, not waiting, just fine, better than fine, a year rebuilt into something whole, even if it wasn't, not completely, not yet. She folded the invitation and set it down carefully, like it might still change its mind. Then she pressed her palms flat against the table, breathed once, and made a decision she wasn't ready to keep. "I'll go," she told herself, "and I won't go alone." She had no idea yet what that decision would cost her or who it would bring into her life. Mrs. Park found her an hour after the invitation arrived, still sitting at the kitchen table with the lights off, the cream envelope untouched beside her hands. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply pulled out the chair across from Nia, set a small cup of warm barley tea in front of her without a word, and waited. It was the waiting that broke her. Naya hadn't cried about David in months, not properly, not the kind of crying that comes from somewhere you can't control. But it came now, quiet and humiliating, right there in the kitchen of a boarding house 8,000 kilometers from home, in front of a woman who had no obligation to witness it. "He invited me," Naya finally managed, sliding the invitation across the table. "He wants closure." Mrs. Park read it slowly, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Then she folded it closed again, the way you'd close a door gently instead of slamming it. "And you are afraid to walk in alone," she said, not a question. Naya laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm afraid of everyone in that room already knowing I'm alone, watching me pretend I'm not." For a long moment, Mrs. Park said nothing. She'd watched this girl arrive a year ago, thin with heartbreak she never spoke of directly, and slowly become someone who laughed again, who ate proper meals, who stopped flinching at the mention of Seoul's wedding season on the news. She hadn't done all that work just to watch her walk into a ballroom and shrink back into who she used to be. She stood, crossed the kitchen, and picked up her phone. Naya wiped her face, confused. "What are you doing?" "Calling someone," Mrs. Park said simply, already scrolling. "Who?" "A boy I've known since he was small enough to hide behind his grandmother's skirt." A faint smile crossed her face, private and knowing. "He owes me nothing, and he will still say yes." Naya wanted to protest. This wasn't Mrs. Park's problem to solve, wasn't a favor she had any right to call in, but something in the older woman's calm certainty stopped her. The line connected. Mrs. Park's voice softened into rapid, familiar Korean, the tone of someone who had made this exact kind of request 100 times before and never once doubted the answer. Naya caught only fragments, a wedding, a favor, just for one evening. She had no idea yet whose name Mrs. Park had just said, or how much that single phone call was about to change. Kang Min-jae was in the middle of reviewing a shipping contract when his grandmother's name lit up his phone. He answered on the second ring, already bracing himself. Mrs. Park never called past 9 unless it mattered. "I need a favor," she said without preamble, "for the girl." He set down his pen. He knew without asking which girl she meant. The tenant she'd talked about for a year now with something close to pride. The one from Nigeria who'd shown up quiet and guarded and slowly learned to laugh at Mrs. Park's terrible jokes. He'd never met her. He'd only heard about her the way you hear about family you haven't gotten around to visiting yet. What kind of favor? Her ex-boyfriend is getting married. She's been invited. She's terrified to go alone. Min-jae exhaled slowly, already understanding where this was going. "You want me to be her date." "You want me to be kind," Mrs. Park corrected. "For one evening, that's all." He didn't answer right away. It wasn't that he minded doing something for Mrs. Park. She'd earned more favors from him than he could count, simply by existing as steadily and unconditionally as she had his whole life. It was the shape of the favor itself. Weddings full of strangers, small talk performed for people who'd forget his name by dessert. He avoided exactly this kind of evening whenever he could. "I don't know her," he said finally. "Won't that make it worse? A stranger showing up with her?" "Better a kind stranger than no one," Mrs. Park said simply. "She has spent a year rebuilding herself, Min-jae. I am not going to let her walk into that room and feel small again." Something about the certainty in her voice settled it. He thought of his own grandmother who spoke about people the exact same way, as though their dignity were something worth defending personally, worth picking up the phone for at 9 at night. "One evening," he said. "One evening," Mrs. Park agreed, and he could hear the smile in it, the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd never once been told no by this particular boy. "Thank you. I will send you the details." He hung up and sat for a moment in the silence of his office, turning the request over. A stranger's wedding, a woman he'd never met about to watch the man she once loved marry someone else. He had no idea yet that one evening was about to be the beginning of something he couldn't undo. Nia hadn't expected Mrs. Park to introduce them properly. She'd pictured a hurried handshake, a name exchanged in passing, maybe even meeting him for the first time in the car outside the venue. Instead, he arrived early, at Mrs. Park's request, no doubt, and stood in the doorway of the boarding house with the kind of stillness that made the small room feel briefly too quiet. "Kang Min-jae," he said, offering a slight bow instead of his hand. "Nia Okafor." She returned it, awkward, unsure of the etiquette, painfully aware of how her voice sounded thinner than she meant it to. He didn't fill the silence with small talk, which she was grateful for. Instead, he simply asked, "What do you need me to do?" It was such a plain, practical question that it steadied her more than any reassurance could have. She explained it as clinically as she could manage. A colleague, a +1, nothing more. Just someone beside her so the whispers had somewhere else to land. He listened without interrupting, arms loosely crossed, expression unreadable. "That's all," she finished. "You don't have to say much. Just be there." "I can do that," he said simply. There was no warmth performed in it, no attempt to comfort her with false enthusiasm, and strangely, that was what made her trust him. He wasn't doing this because he wanted anything from her. He was doing it because Mrs. Park had asked, and some loyalties didn't require explanation. In the car, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar. Two strangers about to walk into a room full of people who would assume they knew each other well. Nia watched the city blur past the window, rehearsing small facts in her head. How long have we been together? Where did we meet? Don't let your voice shake when someone asks. Min-jae glanced over once, catching the tension in her hands. "You don't have to convince everyone. Just don't let him see you flinch." She looked at him, surprised he'd understood the actual fear underneath the plan. Not the wedding itself, but David watching her come apart. "I won't," she said, though she wasn't sure yet if it was true. He nodded once, like that settled it, and turned back to the road. Neither of them spoke again until the venue came into view, its lights already spilling gold across the driveway, and the last quiet moment before the lie began. Nia felt the room shift before she understood why. The ceremony had ended without incident. David hadn't looked her way once she and Min-jae took their seats, and she'd let herself believe, briefly, that this might actually work. But the moment they stepped into the reception hall, something changed. Conversations paused a beat too long. Heads turned, not toward her, but toward the man beside her. She didn't understand it yet. She only understood that David had. He was across the room, half-turned toward a guest, laughing at something she couldn't hear, and then he saw them. The laugh didn't finish. His eyes moved from her face to Min-jae's, and something in his posture went rigid, like a man recalculating a number he'd been certain of a moment ago. Beside him, Han Soo-jin followed his gaze, and for just a second her polished composure flickered too. Not jealousy, Nia thought, but something closer to curiosity, as if she were trying to place a face she half recognized. Nia felt Min-jae's hand settle lightly at the small of her back, steadying rather than performing. "He's staring," she murmured, barely moving her lips. "Let him," Min-jae said. "You came here to be seen, so let him see you." It should have felt like a small victory. Instead, standing this close to David after 2 years, she felt the old ache rise faster than she expected. Not longing, exactly, but the strange vertigo of watching someone you once built a future with become, entirely, a stranger's husband. David excused himself and began crossing the room toward them, and Nia's pulse spiked. "Nia," his voice was careful, testing, I didn't think you'd actually come. You did invite me, she said, keeping her tone light, grateful it didn't shake. His eyes moved to Min-jae, waiting for an introduction that hadn't been offered yet. This is Min-jae, she said simply, no explanation, no elaboration, exactly as they'd planned. David extended a hand, and Min-jae shook it with an ease that gave nothing away, though Nia caught the faint tightening at David's jaw when their hands met, some instinct registering a presence he couldn't quite categorize. Congratulations, Min-jae said evenly. Beautiful wedding. Thank you, David said, though his eyes had already drifted back to Nia, searching her face for something he clearly hadn't expected to still be looking for. Whispers followed them from the moment they crossed into the reception hall, soft, clipped exchanges in Korean that Nia couldn't follow, punctuated by glances that lingered too long on Min-jae and slid past her without settling. Is that the Kang heir? I didn't know he was seeing anyone. An African fiancé? Since when? Nia caught fragments, none of it making sense. She assumed, at first, that people simply recognized Min-jae as someone successful, a businessman whose face turned up occasionally in the kind of circles David's new family moved in. She had no way of knowing the weight behind the name, the decades of careful distance he'd built between himself and a legacy most of the room only spoke of in hushed, half-respectful tones. He, for his part, gave nothing away. If he noticed the attention, he didn't show it. No stiffening, no retreat, just the same steady presence beside her that had carried them through the ceremony. "Everyone keeps staring at you," she murmured, refilling her glass, mostly to have something to do with her hands. "They're curious," he said simply. "About what?" He hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. "Doesn't matter tonight." She wanted to press, but a waiter interrupted with a tray of appetizers, and the moment passed. She let it go, distracted by her own performance, the effort of appearing at ease in a room of people who'd once known her as David's Nia, now recalculating her into someone else's fiancé entirely. Across the hall, she caught David watching them again, his expression harder to read than before. Not quite jealousy, something closer to unease, like a man watching a decision he'd made years ago suddenly cost more than he'd budgeted for. Min-jae leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're doing well." "I don't feel like I'm doing anything," she admitted. "I just feel like I'm standing here." "That's the job tonight," he said, something almost gentle beneath the practicality. "Just stand here, let me handle the rest." She didn't fully understand what handling the rest would come to mean, didn't know that somewhere across the room a phone was already lifted, a photo already taken, a name already being typed into a search bar by someone who recognized exactly who he was. Soojin found her near the edge of the terrace, away from the noise, where Nia had stepped out for a moment to breathe. She hadn't expected to be approached, certainly not by the bride herself, still in her wedding dress, a glass of champagne untouched in her hand. "You're Nia," Soojin said. Not a question, and not unkind, just quiet certainty, the way David might have said her name once, long ago. Nia's guard rose instantly. "I am." "David speaks of you sometimes," Soojin said, looking out over the garden lights rather than at her, which somehow made the moment easier to bear. "Not often, but enough that I know you were significant." Nia didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "I'm not upset that you're here," Soojin said, almost as if she'd anticipated the tension. "I asked him to invite you, actually." That surprised her. "Why?" "Because I wanted to see you," Soojin said simply. "The woman he almost married. I suppose I wanted to understand what I was standing next to." There was no cruelty in it, no performance of superiority, just a strange, unguarded honesty that caught Nia off balance. She studied Sujin properly for the first time that evening, passed the wedding dress and the diamonds, and saw something she hadn't expected: uncertainty, carefully hidden beneath composure that had clearly taken years to perfect. "And? Andy?" Nia asked quietly. "Do you understand now?" Sujin was quiet for a moment. "I understand that some part of him is always going to wonder about a life he didn't choose," she said. "I've made my peace with that, most days." The admissions sat heavier between them than either of their masks let on. "For what it's worth," Nia said, surprising herself, "you don't have to compete with something that's already over." Sujin finally looked at her directly, something like gratitude flickering across her face. "I hope that's true." Before Nia could respond, a voice called Sujin's name from inside, her father, summoning her back toward the reception. She offered a small, genuine smile before turning to go. "Take care of yourself, Nia." Nia watched her disappear back into the gold light of the ballroom, unsettled by how little malice had existed in a conversation she'd braced herself for entirely wrong, and unaware that behind her, a phone screen was already lighting up with the first photo of them and Min-jae, spreading further than either of them could yet imagine. David found her by the drink table, waiting until Min-jae had stepped away to speak with someone who'd recognized him, a small, deliberate window, and Nia realized too late he'd been watching for exactly that. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Just for a minute." She hesitated, then nodded, and he led her a few steps away, out of earshot of the nearest guests. "You look happy," he said, and there was something unsteady beneath the words, like he hadn't expected to mean them and resented that he did. "I am," she said, careful to keep her voice even. "I didn't think you'd bring someone." He glanced back toward Min-jae, still half turned toward the crowd. "I didn't think you'd move on so—" "So what, David?" "So completely." He said it quietly, almost to himself. She studied him, searching for the man she used to know underneath the polished suit and the new last name attached to his life. He looked older, more tired than she remembered, and for a moment she felt something unexpected, not longing, but a strange, distant pity. "I didn't come here to prove anything to you," she said. "Didn't you?" A faint, humorless smile. "Come on, Nia, we both know why people bring someone to a wedding like this." She didn't answer because some part of what he said wasn't entirely wrong, and she hated that he could still see through her that easily. "I'm happy for you," he said, softer now. "Really, He stopped himself, shook his head. "Never mind." "Say it." He looked at her for a long moment, something unresolved sitting behind his eyes. "I didn't expect it to feel like this, seeing you with someone else." "You left, David." She kept her voice low, steady, refusing to let it crack. "You don't get to be surprised that a door closed behind you." He absorbed that quietly, jaw tight, and for the first time all evening he looked less like a groom and more like a man realizing a cost he hadn't fully calculated on his wedding day. "Congratulations," she said, and meant it, mostly, before turning to find Min-jae again, unaware that behind her David's eyes lingered a moment too long, and that somewhere in the crowd a photo of the four of them together had just been posted online. The doors closed behind the last of the wedding guests, and for a moment Nia and Min-jae stood outside the venue in the quiet the night finally allowed. "You did well tonight," he said, loosening his tie slightly, the formality of the evening already slipping from his shoulders. "We did well," she corrected, surprising herself with how easily the "we" came out. He glanced at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes before he looked away, back toward the row of parked cars gleaming under the streetlights. "It's over now. You don't have to keep pretending." "I know," she said, yet something in her chest resisted the idea, quietly, without explanation. They walked toward the car in a silence that felt different from the one on the way there, less like two strangers bracing for a performance, more like two people who'd survived something together and weren't quite ready to name what that meant. "Thank you," she said finally, stopping beside the passenger door. "For tonight, for all of it. You didn't have to be that kind to a stranger." "You stopped being a stranger somewhere around Chapter 3 of tonight's disaster," he said, and for the first time all evening, something almost like a real smile crossed his face. She laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly, and the sound seemed to catch him off guard too, like he hadn't realized how much he'd wanted to hear it. For a moment, standing there under the venue's fading lights, neither of them moved to end it. Whatever this had been, a favor, a performance, a lie constructed out of desperation, it had somehow, without either of them noticing exactly when, stopped feeling like pretending. "Well," he said eventually, opening her door. "Good night, Nia." "Good night, Min-jae." The drive back was quiet, comfortable in a way neither of them examined too closely. When he dropped her outside the boarding house, she lingered a moment before stepping out, some instinct telling her this wasn't really an ending. She had no way of knowing yet how right that instinct was. By the time she climbed the stairs to her room, a photograph from the reception had already traveled far beyond the wedding hall, passed from phone to phone, captioned with a name growing more recognizable by the hour. And across the city, in a quiet apartment, Madame Kang was staring at her phone screen, a smile spreading slowly across her face. If you think this story is over, wait until you see what happens when his grandmother finds out. Subscribe so you don't miss part 2, and tell me in the comments, do you think Nia and Min-jae's fake engagement is about to become very real? Silent Speaks Stories, where every story leaves a mark.